You know those moments when you're minding your own business, folding laundry in what you thought was your home, and suddenly your whole world gets flipped upside down by 3 little words? That was Tuesday afternoon for me. Pack your bags. Just like that. No warning, no discussion, just a cold command that cut through the peaceful silence of our Riverside cottage like a blade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Celeste Hawthorne, and I've been living in this charming 2-bedroom house in Willowbrook for the past 3 years with my husband Marcus. It's nothing fancy: white picket fence, rose garden out front, creaky floorboards that sing lullabies when you walk across them at night. But it was ours. Or so I thought. The voice belonged to Vivian Hawthorne, Marcus's mother, standing in our doorway like she owned the place. Which, as it turns out, she technically did. Her silver hair was pulled back in that severe bun she always wore, the one that made her look like she was perpetually disappointed in the world. Her designer handbag clutched against her chest like armor, lips pursed in that way that meant someone was about to get steamrolled. "Celeste, dear," she said, though the word dear came out like she was spitting out spoiled milk. "I hope you've been keeping the guest room tidy. Priscilla will be moving in next week." Priscilla. Marcus's ex-girlfriend from college. The golden child who could do no wrong in Vivian's eyes. The one with the trust fund, the law degree from Harvard, and the ability to make Vivian laugh at dinner parties while I sat there feeling like furniture. I set down the shirt I was folding, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I'm sorry, what?" "The guest room, darling. Priscilla's going through a difficult divorce, and she needs somewhere to stay. Somewhere appropriate. You understand." The way she said appropriate made it clear that she didn't consider a house with me in it to be appropriate for much of anything. This wasn't the first time Vivian had made her feelings about me crystal clear. From the moment Marcus brought me home 4 years ago, she'd treated me like a temporary inconvenience. A phase he'd grow out of, like his brief obsession with skateboarding in high school. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Years of dealing with Vivian had taught me that showing emotion only gave her more ammunition. She waved her hand dismissively, like she was shooing away a fly. "Oh, I'm sure you'll figure something out. Maybe that little apartment complex near the highway. I hear they have monthly rates." Monthly rates. Like I was some college student crashing on couches instead of the woman who'd been married to her son for 3 years. The woman who'd turned this house into a home, who'd planted the herb garden by the kitchen window, who'd spent countless weekends painting and decorating and making it beautiful. "Does Marcus know about this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus was in Seattle on business, wouldn't be back until Friday. Vivian had timed this perfectly. "Marcus understands that family comes first," she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "And Priscilla is practically family. She's been through so much lately, poor thing." Her husband turned out to be quite the disappointment. Not at all what he seemed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Vivian, talking about disappointing husbands while trying to kick out her actual daughter-in-law in favor of the ex-girlfriend. But I'd learned not to point out Vivian's contradictions. It only made things worse. "I'll need time to pack," I said quietly. "Of course, dear. Take your time. Priscilla won't be here until Monday." 4 days. She was giving me 4 days to pack up 3 years of my life and disappear. 4 days to find somewhere else to live because Marcus's ex-girlfriend needed a place to lick her wounds. After Vivian left, her expensive perfume lingering in the air like a threat, I sat on our couch, my couch, and stared at the walls we'd painted together last spring. Soft yellow, like sunshine. Marcus had insisted on that color because he said it made me smile. The house felt different now, like it had already started rejecting me. The floorboards didn't creak welcomingly under my feet anymore. They whispered accusations. Temporary. Inconvenient. Replaceable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I pulled out my phone to call Marcus, then stopped. What was I supposed to say? Your mother kicked me out of our house for your ex-girlfriend? He'd make excuses, try to smooth things over, promise to fix it when he got back. But the damage would be done. Vivian would have made her point clear. I didn't belong in the Hawthorne family. The afternoon light streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the little herb garden I'd planted there. Basil, rosemary, thyme. I'd nurtured those plants from tiny seedlings, watering them every morning, talking to them like they were friends. Now I wondered if Priscilla would take care of them, or if they'd just wither away. But here's the thing about being underestimated: people stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. They see what they expect to see, a quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law who'll pack her bags without a fuss. What they don't see is everything else. What they don't know about the woman they're so casually discarding. And Vivian Hawthorne was about to learn that sometimes, the person you think has nothing to offer is the one holding all the cards. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Marcus's sister Elena banging through the front door like she owned the place. Which, given the family dynamics, maybe she thought she did too. Celeste. Where are you, honey? Elena's voice carried that fake sweetness she'd perfected over the years. The kind that sounded supportive until you realized she was gathering information to report back to Vivian. I found her in the kitchen, already helping herself to coffee from the pot I'd made an hour earlier. Elena Hawthorne Price was everything Vivian wanted in a daughter: tall, blonde, married to a successful plastic surgeon, with 2 perfectly behaved children who played violin and spoke French. She wore her privilege like expensive jewelry, always visible, always gleaming. Morning, Elena, I said, grabbing my own mug. Didn't know you were coming by. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mom called. Said there might be some changes around here. Changes. Like I was a piece of furniture being moved around for better feng shui. Priscilla's moving in for a while, I said simply, watching Elena's reaction. She tried to look surprised, but I caught the flicker of satisfaction in her expression. Oh, that's very generous of you and Marcus to help her out during her divorce. Elena settled into the breakfast nook like she was hosting a morning show. Though I suppose it might be a bit cramped with all 3 of you here. There it was. The assumption that I'd somehow be staying, playing the role of gracious hostess to my husband's ex-girlfriend. Elena had always been good at delivering insults wrapped in concern. Actually, your mother suggested I find other accommodations. Elena's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. She what? The guest room is for Priscilla. I'm packing. For a moment, Elena looked genuinely shocked. Maybe she hadn't expected Vivian to be quite so direct. But then her expression shifted into something that looked almost like relief. Well, she said carefully, maybe this is for the best. I mean, you and Marcus have been married 3 years now? And you still don't have children. Maybe some time apart would help you both reassess things. Reassess. Another Hawthorne family euphemism. Like when they said Marcus was exploring his options before he settled down, or when they described my job as keeping busy instead of actual work. Elena, I said, my voice steady as granite, are you suggesting that my marriage is failing because I don't have children yet? She laughed, that tinkling sound she'd practiced at cotillion. Oh, sweetie, of course not. I just think, Priscilla always understood the family expectations better. She and Marcus had such similar backgrounds, similar goals. Similar trust funds, I thought. Similar country club memberships. Similar assumptions that the world owed them everything they wanted. I should let you pack, Elena continued, standing up and smoothing her designer yoga pants. This must be so overwhelming for you. I can't imagine having to start over at your age. I was 31. Not exactly retirement age, but Elena had a gift for making everything sound like a tragedy. After she left, I sat in my kitchen, for now, still my kitchen, and thought about the Hawthorne family dynamics. It was like a perfectly choreographed dance where everyone knew the steps except me. Marcus was the golden son who could do no wrong. Elena was the perfect daughter who'd married well and produced heirs. Vivian was the matriarch who orchestrated everything from her mansion in Greenfield Heights. And then there was me. The outsider who'd somehow convinced Marcus to marry her but had never quite figured out how to fit into their world. They'd tolerated me because Marcus loved me, but tolerance wasn't acceptance. It wasn't belonging. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Hey babe, meeting's running late. Miss you. How's everything?" I stared at the message for a long time. How was everything? His mother had just evicted me from our home. His sister had stopped by to make sure I understood that this was probably for the best. His ex-girlfriend was moving into our guest room while I got shuffled off to some highway motel. But here's what none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask about or understand. I wasn't just some small-town girl who'd gotten lucky enough to marry into their family. I wasn't just the quiet wife who baked cookies for charity events and smiled politely at dinner parties while they discussed their important lives. I had a life before Marcus. I had achievements, accomplishments, a career that mattered. Things I'd never talked about because, frankly, they'd never asked. They'd made assumptions about who I was based on where I'd come from, and I'd let them. Maybe that was my mistake. I typed back, "Everything's fine. Handle your business. We'll talk when you get home." Then I walked into our bedroom and started making phone calls. Not to find a temporary apartment or to beg Marcus to come home early and fix this mess his mother had created. I was calling people who knew exactly who Celeste Hawthorne really was. People who understood what I'd done before I'd become Mrs. Marcus Hawthorne. People who'd been waiting for me to remember that I didn't need anyone's permission to be exactly who I'd always been. The Hawthorne family thought they were reshuffling the deck. What they didn't realize was that they'd just awakened someone who'd been playing a completely different game all along. And the rules were about to change. By Thursday morning, the house felt like a war zone where only one side knew they were fighting. I'd spent the previous day quietly going through my things, sorting what to keep from what could be left behind. But every drawer I opened, every closet I emptied, felt like another small victory for Vivian's campaign to erase me from her son's life. That's when Priscilla showed up. She didn't knock. Just walked through the front door like she still had a key from when she and Marcus dated 6 years ago. Maybe she did. With the Hawthornes, you never knew what traditions they'd preserved in amber. Celeste. Her voice rang out with that particular brand of enthusiasm that rich women use when they're about to destroy your life but want to seem friendly about it. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by early. I wanted to see the space before I move my things in." I emerged from the bedroom to find Priscilla Wellington Cross standing in my living room, surveying it like a real estate agent evaluating property. She looked exactly the same as she had in college photos, tall, willowy, with that effortless blonde hair that probably cost more to maintain than most people's rent. Her outfit screamed expensive casual, designer jeans that fit like they were custom-made, a cashmere sweater in soft pink, and boots that cost more than my car payment. "Hello, Priscilla," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You're a bit early." "I'm still packing." She waved her manicured hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm just getting a feel for the layout." Vivian said the guest room has the lovely garden view. The lovely garden view. Of my herb garden. The one I'd planted and tended for 3 years. I watched her walk toward the guest room like she was touring a hotel suite, and something cold settled in my stomach. "This is perfect," she called from the bedroom. "Much better than that awful apartment I was staying in temporarily. The divorce lawyer said I should be somewhere more stable during the proceedings." Stable. Like my marriage, my home, my life here wasn't stable. Like I was the temporary fixture and she was the permanent resident coming home. She emerged from the guest room with a satisfied smile. "I hope Marcus won't mind that I'm borrowing his space for a while. Though I suppose he'll hardly notice with his travel schedule." There was something calculated about the way she said it. Like she knew Marcus's schedule. Like maybe they'd been talking more than I realized. "Actually," she continued, settling herself on my couch like she belonged there, "I ran into him in Seattle yesterday." What a coincidence. My lawyer had meetings in the same building as his conference. We grabbed coffee and caught up. My blood went cold. Marcus hadn't mentioned running into Priscilla. Hadn't mentioned coffee. Just his usual text about meetings running late. It was so nice to talk to someone who really understands the pressure I'm under, Priscilla continued, watching my face carefully. Divorce is such a complicated process, especially when there are significant assets involved. Marcus was so sympathetic. He always was good at listening. She stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where our wedding photos were displayed. She picked up the largest one, Marcus and me on the beach in Santorini, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. "You two look happy here," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Though Marcus looks a bit tired, doesn't he? All that travel, all that work stress." Vivian mentioned he's been having trouble sleeping lately. I hadn't known Marcus was having trouble sleeping. We usually talked every night when he was traveling, but our conversations had been shorter lately. More distracted. I'd assumed it was just work pressure. Of course, Priscilla continued, setting the photo back down but not quite in the right place. Stress affects everyone differently. Some people withdraw. Some people start questioning their choices. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't just about needing a place to stay during her divorce. This was reconnaissance. This was a woman who'd never gotten over losing Marcus, who saw his mother's intervention as an opportunity to reclaim what she thought belonged to her. "Priscilla," I said quietly, "what exactly are you implying?" She turned to me with wide, innocent eyes. "Implying? Nothing at all. I'm just concerned about Marcus." He seemed conflicted when we talked. Like he's been doing a lot of thinking about his life, his future. You know how he gets when he's processing big decisions. I did know. Marcus was a methodical thinker who liked to work through problems alone before discussing them. But the idea that he was processing doubts about our marriage with his ex-girlfriend felt like a knife between my ribs. "I'm sure he'll work through whatever's bothering him," I managed. "Oh, I'm sure he will too," Priscilla smiled. Marcus always was decisive once he figured out what he really wanted. She moved toward the kitchen, running her fingers along the countertops I'd chosen, examining the appliances we'd bought together. "This is such a cozy little place. Very quaint. Though I imagine it must feel a bit small for someone with Marcus's ambitions. He always dreamed of something grander, didn't he?" I watched her catalog my life like she was taking inventory. She opened cabinet doors, peered into the pantry, even looked inside the refrigerator. Making herself at home. Marking her territory. "I should probably start moving my things in this weekend," she said, returning to the living room. "That way I'll be settled when Marcus gets back from his trip. We can all sit down and figure out the new arrangement." New arrangement. Like I was staff being reassigned rather than the wife being displaced. "Vivian thought it might be nice if we all had dinner together once I'm moved in," Priscilla continued. "Just to make sure everyone's comfortable with the situation. She's making her famous pot roast." Her famous pot roast. The one she only made for special occasions. The one she'd never made for me in 3 years of marriage. After Priscilla left, I sat in my kitchen and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't just Vivian's power play anymore. This was a coordinated effort. A carefully planned campaign to push me out and install Priscilla in my place. And Marcus? My husband of 3 years, the man who'd sworn to love and protect me? He was having coffee dates with his ex-girlfriend and discussing his conflicted feelings about our marriage. But here's what Priscilla and Vivian and Elena didn't understand. I wasn't the helpless small-town girl they thought they were dealing with. I wasn't some naive woman who'd stumbled into their world by accident. I was someone who'd been underestimated before. Someone who'd learned how to play the long game while everyone else focused on short-term victories. And I was about to remind them all that the quiet ones are quiet for a reason. Because we're listening. We're watching. We're planning. And we're never as powerless as we appear. Friday afternoon brought reinforcements to Vivian's army. I was in the middle of wrapping my grandmother's china when I heard the familiar sound of expensive heels clicking up the front walkway. Through the window, I watched as Vivian approached with her sister Margaret and her longtime friend Constance Pemberton. The triumvirate of Willowbrook high society, dressed for battle in their coordinated pastels and pearl necklaces. They didn't knock either. Apparently, respecting boundaries wasn't a Hawthorne family trait. "Celeste, darling." Vivian's voice carried that false brightness she used when she had an audience. "I brought some friends to help with your transition." Margaret Hawthorne Stone, Vivian's younger sister, swept into my living room like she was inspecting troops. She'd always been the more direct of the two sisters, where Vivian preferred subtle manipulation, Margaret wielded cruelty like a blunt instrument. Her silver hair was styled in that aggressive bob that seemed designed to cut people down to size. "My goodness," Margaret said, surveying the boxes I'd been packing. "You've certainly accumulated quite a collection of things over the years." Constance Pemberton nodded in agreement. She'd been Vivian's best friend since boarding school, a woman who'd never worked a day in her life but somehow felt qualified to judge everyone else's choices. Her voice dripped with practiced sympathy. "Moving can be so overwhelming, especially when it's unexpected. But sometimes these changes are blessings in disguise." Blessings in disguise. I bit back the urge to ask exactly how being kicked out of my own home by my mother-in-law qualified as divine intervention. "We thought you might need some guidance," Vivian continued, settling herself on my sofa like she was hosting a tea party. "After all, starting over can be quite daunting for someone in your situation." My situation. Code 4, someone without a trust fund, family connections, or the proper breeding to navigate their world. Margaret picked up one of my books from a box, a well-worn copy of Silent Spring, that I'd kept since college. She examined it like it was evidence of poor character. "Environmental science," she said with a slight sneer. "How earnest of you." "Everyone needs hobbies," Constance added with a patronizing smile. "Though I suppose you'll have more time for reading now that you won't have a household to manage." They moved through my living room like appraisers, picking up items and making small comments designed to diminish everything I'd built here. Vivian examined the throw pillows I'd sewn myself, running her fingers over the fabric with obvious disapproval. "These are quite rustic," she said. "Priscilla has such sophisticated taste. She'll probably want to redecorate completely once she's settled." "I'm sure Marcus won't mind the changes," Margaret added. "Men adapt so easily when they're surrounded by proper elegance." Proper elegance. As opposed to whatever they thought I'd been providing for the past 3 years. Constance wandered into the kitchen and returned with a disapproving expression. "Celeste, dear, I noticed you have quite an extensive spice collection. Very ambitious for someone with such a small kitchen." Priscilla mentioned she prefers simpler meals. More refined tastes. Every comment was a small blade, designed to cut away at my confidence piece by piece. They were systematically dismantling not just my belongings, but my sense of belonging here. Making it clear that everything I'd done, every choice I'd made, every way I'd tried to make this house a home was wrong. "You know," Vivian said, settling back into the cushions, "I've been thinking about what would be best for everyone involved. This separation might give you and Marcus time to really evaluate your compatibility." "Evaluate our compatibility?" I repeated carefully. "Well, darling," Margaret interjected, "you have to admit that you and Marcus come from very different worlds. Sometimes what feels like love in the beginning is really just fascination with something unfamiliar." Constance nodded sagely. "Young men often go through phases of rebellion against their upbringing. It's quite natural. But eventually, they come home to what they really understand." What they really understand. Like Priscilla, with her Harvard Law degree and her country club membership and her ability to discuss wine vintages without looking at the price tag. Marcus has always been drawn to projects, Vivian continued. "Remember when he tried to restore that old motorcycle? Or when he wanted to backpack through Europe instead of doing the proper grand tour? This marriage might just be another phase he needed to work through." A phase. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of building a life together, reduced to a phase. Like I was some quarter-life crisis he'd eventually outgrow. Of course, Margaret added, if this really is just a temporary arrangement with Priscilla, you could always visit. Once things settle into their natural order. Visit. Visit my own home, my own husband, like a distant relative invited for holidays. They continued their psychological demolition for another hour, picking apart every aspect of my life with surgical precision. My clothes were too casual. My education too narrow. My background too humble. My interests too intellectual for someone without the proper foundation to understand complex issues. By the time they left, the house felt poisoned. Every room carried the residue of their criticism, every surface seemed to mock me with their implications that nothing I'd done here had ever been good enough. I sat on the floor surrounded by half-packed boxes and tried to understand how my life had become this. How had I let myself become so isolated that 3 women could walk into my home and dismantle my entire sense of worth in the span of an afternoon? But then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was anger finally overriding the shock. Or maybe it was just the slow realization that I'd been playing defense in a game where I should have been controlling the offense all along. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Dr. Sarah Chen, my former supervisor at the Environmental Protection Agency. We'd kept in touch sporadically over the years, but I'd never told her about feeling sidelined in my marriage, about how I'd gradually allowed myself to become smaller and smaller to fit into the Hawthorne family dynamic. My finger hovered over her number. One call would change everything. One call would remind everyone exactly who Celeste Hawthorne used to be, and more importantly, who she still was underneath all their attempts to diminish her. But I didn't make the call yet. Not quite yet. Because first, I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to push this. I wanted to understand the full scope of their plan before I reminded them that they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was powerless because I'd chosen to be quiet. But quiet and powerless are 2 very different things. And they were about to learn the difference. Marcus came home that evening while I was sitting in our darkened living room, surrounded by the ghosts of conversations that had haunted me all week. I heard his key in the lock, the familiar sound of his travel bag hitting the floor, his tired sigh echoing through the hallway. Celeste? Babe, why are all the lights off? I didn't answer immediately. I was savoring this moment, the last few seconds before everything exploded. Before my husband of 3 years discovered that his mother had orchestrated my exile while he was away, and that his ex-girlfriend had already started measuring the windows for new curtains. I'm in here, I said quietly. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit from the hallway. He looked exhausted, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel. For a split second, I felt that familiar tug of affection, the impulse to get up and welcome him home the way I always did. Then I remembered Priscilla's words about their coffee date. About how understanding he'd been. About his conflicted feelings. What's with all the boxes? He asked, flipping on the lamp. The sudden light revealed the extent of my packing, 3 days' worth of systematically dismantling the life we'd built together. Your mother stopped by while you were gone, I said, my voice steady as glass. She had some interesting news about our living arrangements. Marcus set down his briefcase and really looked around the room for the first time. The boxes. The empty shelves. The wedding photos carefully wrapped and stacked in a corner. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, realization, and finally, something that might have been guilt. Celeste. He started, but I held up my hand. Let me save us both some time, I said, standing up slowly. Your mother has decided that Priscilla needs the guest room during her divorce. Since the house only has 2 bedrooms, she suggested I find alternative accommodations. Something more appropriate for someone in my situation. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was trying to process bad news. She can't just. I mean, this is our home. You can't just kick someone out of their own home. Apparently, I can be, I said. Your mother made it very clear that Priscilla's needs take priority. Family first, as she put it. But you are family, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. Am I? I asked. Because your sister stopped by to explain how this might actually be good for our marriage. Time to reassess things, she said. And your mother brought reinforcements yesterday to help me understand that our marriage might just be a phase you needed to work through. Marcus's face went white. They said that? They said a lot of things, Marcus. But the most interesting part was when Priscilla stopped by to preview her new living space. She mentioned running into you in Seattle. Having coffee. How sympathetic you were about her divorce. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Marcus's reflection in the darkened window behind him, saw the way his shoulders sagged as he realized exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. It wasn't like that, he said finally. I ran into her at the coffee shop in the lobby. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. About what? About her situation. The divorce. How difficult everything's been for her. And did you mention that your mother was planning to move her into our guest room while kicking your wife out? Marcus went very still. I didn't know about that. I swear, Celeste, I had no idea what my mother was planning. But you did know Priscilla needed somewhere to stay. She mentioned it. Said she was looking for something temporary. And it never occurred to you to mention this conversation to me? Your wife? Marcus sat heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. I should have. I know I should have. But I knew how you felt about her, and I didn't want to upset you over nothing. Nothing. A 20-minute heart-to-heart with his ex-girlfriend was nothing. His mother's coordinated campaign to replace me with said ex-girlfriend was nothing. The systematic demolition of my place in his family was nothing. Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the darkness like a blade, do you want this marriage? He looked up at me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. Not love. Not reassurance. Not the immediate, instinctive defense of our relationship I'd expected. Uncertainty. Of course I do, he said, but the pause before he answered told me everything I needed to know. Do you? I pressed. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been having doubts for a while. And rather than talking to your wife about those doubts, you've been discussing them with your ex-girlfriend while your mother orchestrates my replacement. It's not like that, Marcus said, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. Then what is it like? I demanded. Explain to me how your mother can kick me out of our home, install your ex-girlfriend in my place, and you don't see a problem with any of this until you come home to find me packing. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked around the room, taking in the full scope of what had happened while he was gone. The systematic erasure of my presence. The casual dismissal of my place in his life. I'll talk to my mother, he said finally. I'll fix this. Will you? I asked. Because she seems pretty confident that you'll come around to her way of thinking. She seems to believe this is what you really want, deep down. That's not. Marcus started, then stopped. Celeste, you have to understand. My family, they have very specific expectations. Expectations. There was that word again. The same word Elena had used. The same concept that had been weaponized against me for 3 years. And where do I fit into those expectations, Marcus? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Marcus stared at his hands, at the floor, at anything except my face. And in that silence, I heard my answer more clearly than if he'd shouted it. I didn't fit. I never had. I'd been tolerated, accommodated, endured. But I'd never actually belonged in the world he'd been raised to inhabit. I need some air, I said, grabbing my jacket from the back of a chair. Celeste, wait. No, Marcus. I'm done waiting. I've been waiting for 3 years for your family to accept me. Waiting for you to defend me. Waiting to feel like I belong somewhere in your life besides the margins. I headed for the door, then turned back. When I come back, I want you to have made a decision. Not about the house. Not about Priscilla. About whether you want to be married to me or married to your family's expectations. I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving my husband sitting in our half-packed living room, finally forced to confront the choice he'd been avoiding for years. But what Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already made my decision. I was done being underestimated. Done being dismissed. Done playing small so others could feel big. The Hawthorne family thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. They were about to discover they'd been wrong about the game entirely. I drove through the quiet streets of Willowbrook until I found myself parked outside the Riverside Community Center, a modest brick building that most of the Hawthorne family would drive past without a second glance. But I'd spent considerable time here over the past 3 years, volunteering for their environmental education programs. Not because it looked good on a resume, but because it mattered. The parking lot was nearly empty except for one familiar car, a practical Honda Civic that belonged to Dr. James Morrison, the center's director. I'd worked closely with him on several water quality initiatives, and he'd become something of a mentor during my years in Willowbrook. More importantly, he was one of the few people in town who actually knew what I'd done before becoming Mrs. Marcus Hawthorne. I found him in his office, hunched over a laptop with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The walls around him were covered with charts tracking local river pollution levels, photographs of wetland restoration projects, and certificates from various environmental agencies. Real work. Meaningful work. The kind that created lasting change rather than just impressive dinner party conversation. "Celeste," he said, looking up with genuine surprise. "I wasn't expecting to see you tonight. Everything all right?" I settled into the chair across from his desk, suddenly unsure how to begin. For 3 years, I'd compartmentalized my life so carefully that even James only knew fragments of what I was dealing with at home. "James, can I ask you something? Hypothetically?" He leaned back in his chair, giving me his full attention. "Of course. If someone spent years trying to fit into a world that never really wanted them, and then that world suddenly decided they didn't belong at all, what would you advise them to do?" James studied my face for a long moment. He was in his 60s, with the kind of weathered features that came from decades of outdoor fieldwork, and eyes that had seen enough human drama to read between the lines. "Hypothetically," he asked gently. "Hypothetically. I'd remind them that their worth isn't determined by other people's recognition. And I'd ask if they'd forgotten who they were before they started trying to be someone else." The words hit harder than I'd expected. I felt tears prick at my eyes and blinked them back quickly. "James, what if I told you that the hypothetical person was thinking about making some major life changes? What if they were considering going back to who they used to be?" His expression shifted, became more alert. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" I took a deep breath. The kind that would remind everyone who'd written them off that they made a very serious mistake. James removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture I'd learned meant he was choosing his words with precision. "Celeste," he said quietly, "are we still speaking hypothetically?" I met his eyes. "No. I don't think we are." "Then let me be direct. I've watched you for 3 years, and I've seen you diminish yourself bit by bit. You've got one of the sharpest environmental minds I've ever worked with, but you've been playing it down, keeping quiet about your background, your achievements." Why? The question I'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. Why had I made myself smaller? Why had I let the Hawthornes convince me that my worth was tied to their approval? Because I wanted to belong somewhere, I admitted. And I thought if I was too much myself, I'd lose what I had. "And how's that strategy working out for you?" I laughed, but it came out bitter. "I'm being evicted from my own home so my husband's ex-girlfriend can move in." "So not great." James's eyebrows shot up. "Jesus, Celeste. What happened?" I told him everything. Vivian's ultimatum, Priscilla's reconnaissance mission, the systematic campaign to erase me from Marcus's life. As I spoke, James's expression grew darker. "You know," he said when I finished, "there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you anyway. Something that might be relevant to your current situation." He turned to his computer and pulled up an email. I got a call last week from the EPA. They're looking for someone to head up a new initiative, the Coastal Water Protection Task Force. It's a significant position, federal level, based out of Washington, D.C. The salary is, well, let's just say it would be life-changing. He turned the screen toward me. The job description made my heart race. It was everything I'd trained for, everything I'd dreamed about before I'd convinced myself that being Marcus's wife was enough. James, why are you showing me this? Because I recommended you for it, he said simply. Based on your work here, your previous experience with the EPA, and your dissertation research on coastal ecosystem management. They want to interview you next week. I stared at the screen, processing what he was telling me. You recommended me? But I haven't worked for the EPA in years. I've just been volunteering. Celeste, James said, his voice gentle but firm, you designed the water quality monitoring system we've been using for the Riverside Conservation Project. You identified the pollution sources that led to the cleanup of Willowbrook Creek. You've been instrumental in every major environmental initiative in this county for the past 3 years. That's not just volunteering. That's professional-level environmental science. But the Hawthornes always made it sound like. Like what? Like community service was somehow less important than whatever they do? James's voice carried an edge of anger I'd rarely heard from him. Celeste, do you have any idea how many people have clean drinking water because of work you've done? How many ecosystems are healthier because of your research? I felt something shifting inside me, like a dam beginning to crack. For 3 years, I'd let the Hawthornes define the value of my work, my education, my contributions. I'd accepted their dismissive comments about my little environmental projects and their suggestions that I should focus on more appropriate activities for a woman in my position. There's something else, James continued. The task force position comes with a significant budget for hiring staff. You'd be building a team, setting policy, working directly with congressional committees on environmental legislation. James, I can't. I mean, it's been years since I worked at that level. Has it? Because looking at your work here, I'd say you never stopped. You just convinced yourself it didn't count. He pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. I've been documenting everything you've done since you moved to Willowbrook. Every project, every analysis, every recommendation. It's an impressive portfolio. I opened the folder and felt my breath catch. 3 years of work laid out in organized detail. Water quality reports with my name on them. Environmental impact assessments I'd authored. Letters of commendation from state agencies for projects I'd led. A body of work that told the story of who I really was, what I'd really been doing while the Hawthornes dismissed me as a housewife with hobbies. Why? I asked. Why did you keep all this? Because I knew that someday you'd remember who you are, James said. And when you did, you'd need proof. I looked up at him, this man who'd seen my worth when I'd forgotten it myself. The interview is Tuesday, he said quietly. In D.C. I could drive you, if you wanted. We could make a day of it. Tuesday. 4 days away. 4 days to decide whether to keep trying to fit into a world that would never accept me, or to step back into the life I'd left behind. James, I said slowly, what if I told you I was interested? What would that mean? He smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. It would mean reminding a lot of people that they seriously underestimated Celeste Hawthorne. I closed the folder and looked around his office again. At the evidence of work that mattered, change that lasted, impact that could be measured in restored ecosystems rather than dinner party invitations. Can I think about it? Of course. But Celeste? Don't think too long. Some opportunities don't wait. I drove home slowly, the folder on the passenger seat beside me like a bridge back to the person I used to be. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I knew exactly what I was going to do. It was time to stop being the quiet one. It was time to remind everyone who Celeste Hawthorne really was. When I walked back into the house, Marcus was exactly where I'd left him, sitting on the couch, staring at the boxes that contained the remnants of our life together. But now he had company. Priscilla sat beside him, close enough that their knees were almost touching, her perfectly manicured hand resting sympathetically on his arm. They both looked up when I entered, and I caught something in their expressions, a flicker of guilt, maybe, or surprise at being discovered. Marcus pulled away from Priscilla slightly, but not quickly enough to hide the intimacy of their positioning. "Celeste," Priscilla said, rising gracefully from the couch with that practiced smile she'd perfected at cotillion. "I hope you don't mind that I stopped by. Marcus seemed so upset when he called me, and I thought he could use a friendly ear." He'd called her. While I was gone for barely 2 hours, processing the ruins of our marriage, my husband had called his ex-girlfriend for comfort. "How thoughtful of you," I said, my voice level as a frozen lake. Marcus stood up, running his hands through his hair again. "Celeste, it's not what you think. I needed someone to talk to who would understand the family dynamics." "Family dynamics," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling this now?" Priscilla stepped forward, her voice soft and conciliatory. "I know this must be incredibly difficult for you, Celeste. Change always is. But sometimes these situations work out better than anyone expects." There was something in her tone, something almost victorious. Like she was barely containing her satisfaction at finding Marcus vulnerable and available for her particular brand of consolation. "I'm sure they do," I said. "Especially when they've been carefully orchestrated." Marcus frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I set my purse down on the counter and turned to face them both. "It means, Marcus, that your mother didn't just decide to help Priscilla on a whim. This has been planned. Coordinated. And you." I looked directly at Priscilla. "You've been gathering intelligence for weeks, haven't you?" Priscilla's perfect composure slipped just slightly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it directly. You've been positioning yourself as the better option. The one who understands Marcus's world, his family, his expectations. The one who belongs in a way his current wife never could." "Celeste," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "you're being paranoid." "Am I? Then explain to me how your ex-girlfriend happened to have legal meetings in the same building as your conference. How she knew about your travel schedule. How she was already measuring windows before she'd officially been invited to move in." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken admissions. Priscilla's perfect mask slipped another degree, revealing something calculating underneath. "Marcus," I continued, "ask her when she filed for divorce." "What does that have to do with anything?" he demanded. "Just ask her." Marcus turned to Priscilla, confusion clear on his face. "When did you file?" Priscilla hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicions. 2 months ago, she said finally. 2 months, I repeated. Right around the time your mother started making comments about how I wasn't fitting in properly. Right around the time you started having those work stress episodes that kept you up at night. Interesting timing. Marcus's face went white. "Priscilla, you said the divorce was recent." "It is recent," she said quickly. 2 months is very recent in legal terms. "But long enough to plan this whole scenario," I said. "Long enough to coordinate with Vivian. Long enough to start working on Marcus's doubts about our marriage." "That's ridiculous," Priscilla protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up our wedding photo, the one Priscilla had moved during her earlier visit. "You know what I realized tonight, Marcus? I've been fighting the wrong battle. I've been trying to prove I belong in your family's world, when I should have been asking why I'd want to. What's that supposed to mean?" I turned to face him, holding the photo between us like evidence in a trial. "It means I spent 3 years making myself smaller so your family could feel bigger. I stopped talking about my work, my achievements, my goals, because it made them uncomfortable. I let them dismiss everything that mattered to me as cute little hobbies." "Your work is important," Marcus said, but he sounded uncertain. "Is it? Because when I mentioned the water quality project I'd been leading, your mother called it playing in the dirt. When I tried to discuss my research on coastal ecosystems, Your sister said it was very earnest, and we both know that was not a compliment. Priscilla shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps this isn't the best time for this conversation. On the contrary, I said, turning my attention to her, I think this is the perfect time. Because I want to know something, Priscilla. What exactly do you think you're winning here? I'm not trying to win anything, she said, but her hand moved unconsciously toward Marcus's arm again. Aren't you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've spent 2 months orchestrating a campaign to replace me. But here's what I'm curious about, do you actually want Marcus, or do you just want to prove you can take him back? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Priscilla's perfect composure cracked a little more. I care about Marcus, she said carefully. That's not what I asked. I asked if you want him, or if you just want to win. Marcus looked between us, finally beginning to see the manipulation he'd been blind to. Priscilla, what is she talking about? She's upset, Priscilla said quickly. She's lashing out because she's losing her position in the family. My position in the family, I repeated slowly. Marcus, do you hear how she talks about our marriage? Like it's a corporate hierarchy where I'm being demoted? Something shifted in Marcus's expression. For the first time since I'd known him, he was really looking at the situation instead of just reacting to it. You know what the saddest part is? I continued, setting the wedding photo face down on the mantel. I actually thought I loved you enough to disappear myself completely. I thought that's what love was, making yourself small enough to fit into someone else's life without causing any inconvenience. Celeste. But tonight I remembered something important. I remembered who I was before I started trying to be who you needed me to be. I walked over to where my purse sat on the counter and pulled out the folder James had given me. 3 years of work that mattered. 3 years of impact and achievement that the Hawthornes had dismissed as irrelevant. This, I said, holding up the folder, is who I really am. And tomorrow, I'm going to start being her again. Marcus stared at the folder like it was written in a language he couldn't read. What are you saying? I'm saying that this conversation is over. Both of you can have exactly what you want, each other, this house, Vivian's approval. All of it. Celeste, wait, Marcus said, finally standing up. We need to talk about this. No, Marcus. You needed to talk about this months ago, before you started having coffee dates with your ex-girlfriend. Before you let your mother kick me out of our home. Before you spent 3 years watching me disappear piece by piece and doing nothing to stop it. I headed toward the stairs, then turned back one more time. By the way, Priscilla. You might want to ask Marcus about his actual financial situation before you get too comfortable. The trust fund he's been living on? It was contingent on maintaining certain family standards. Including marriage to someone from an appropriate background. When that ends. I shrugged. Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out. I left them sitting in the ruins of their carefully laid plans, finally forced to confront what they'd actually won. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe again. I spent Sunday morning alone in the house for the first time in months. Marcus had left early, he mumbled something about needing to think and drove off in his BMW before I'd even finished my coffee. Priscilla was notably absent too, probably regrouping after my revelation about Marcus's financial dependencies. The silence felt different this time. Not empty, but full of possibility. I was sitting at the kitchen table with James's folder spread out before me when an unexpected knock came at the front door. Through the window, I could see a sleek black sedan in the driveway, government plates. My heart skipped as I recognized the woman walking up the path. Director Sarah Chen from the Environmental Protection Agency looked exactly as I remembered her, sharp, professional, with an air of quiet authority that made people listen when she spoke. She'd been my supervisor during my years with the EPA, before I'd left to marry Marcus and convinced myself that love meant sacrificing career ambition. I opened the door, genuinely shocked. Sarah? What are you doing here? She smiled, though her expression was serious. Hello, Celeste. I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. James Morrison gave me your address. We need to talk. I gestured her inside, my mind racing. Of course. Can I get you coffee? That would be perfect. As I prepared the coffee, Sarah examined the boxes still scattered around the living room, her trained investigator's eye taking in details I probably hadn't even noticed myself. Moving? She asked casually. Something like that, I said, handing her a mug. Sarah, how did you even know I was here? I thought you were based in San Francisco now. I am. But I'm here on official business. She settled into the chair across from me with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Celeste, what do you know about the Riverside Industrial Complex? The question caught me completely off guard. The chemical plant outside town? Not much. It's been there for decades. Why? Sarah pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. On the screen was a satellite image of the Willowbrook area, with various colored markers indicating different types of environmental monitoring stations. For the past 18 months, we've been tracking some concerning pollution patterns in this region. Water contamination, soil toxicity levels, unusual wildlife mortality rates. The markers all point back to illegal dumping from the Riverside complex. I studied the data, my environmental science training automatically kicking in. These mercury levels are off the charts. And the groundwater contamination. I looked up at her. Sarah, this is catastrophic. How long has this been going on? That's what we're trying to determine. But here's the interesting part. She tapped another section of the screen. Someone has been conducting unofficial water quality monitoring in this exact area for the past 3 years. Someone with extensive knowledge of environmental testing protocols and access to professional-grade equipment. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. James told you about my work. James told me that you've been running the most comprehensive environmental monitoring program he's ever seen, and that you've been doing it as a volunteer. He also told me that you've identified several pollution sources that local authorities have been ignoring. She leaned forward, her expression intensifying. Celeste, your data is the missing piece we need to build a federal case against Riverside Industrial. Your 3 years of documentation could shut down one of the largest illegal dumping operations on the East Coast. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My little environmental projects, I said quietly, remembering Vivian's dismissive words. You're what? Nothing. It's just. I shook my head. For 3 years, my husband's family has been treating my work like a hobby. Something to keep me busy while I figured out how to be a proper wife. Sarah's expression darkened. Celeste, the data James showed me represents hundreds of hours of professional-level environmental analysis. The kind of work that usually requires entire teams of specialists. She pulled up another screen on her tablet. Look at this. You identified the connection between the industrial runoff and the fish kills in Millbrook Creek 18 months before our official investigation began. You documented the correlation between chemical spills and the elevated cancer rates in 3 surrounding neighborhoods. You've essentially been running a one-person EPA field office. I stared at the screen, seeing my work through professional eyes for the first time in years. I noticed patterns. I had the equipment from my old job, so I started testing. You started building a case, Sarah corrected. Whether you realized it or not, you've been conducting a federal-level environmental investigation. She closed the tablet and looked at me directly. Which brings me to why I'm here. We need your testimony. We need your data. And we need you to lead the prosecution team's environmental analysis. Lead the prosecution team? Celeste, you know this case better than anyone. You've been living it for 3 years. The EPA is prepared to offer you a position as Senior Environmental Analyst for the Riverside investigation. Full federal authority, substantial budget, a team of specialists reporting to you. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I could hear my own heartbeat as the magnitude of what Sarah was offering settled in. There's something else, she continued. The Riverside complex is owned by Pemberton Holdings. Constance Pemberton. Vivian's best friend, the woman who'd stood in my living room yesterday dismissing my earnest little hobbies, while her company was systematically poisoning the community I'd been trying to protect. Jesus, I breathed. It gets better. The company's legal representation is Wellington, Cross and Associates, Priscilla's family firm. The same firm that had been handling her divorce, the same connections that had probably helped her coordinate this entire campaign against my marriage. Sarah watched my face as the pieces clicked into place. Celeste, you've been investigating the environmental crimes of your husband's social circle without even realizing it. Your 3 years of volunteer work has built a case that could send several very wealthy, very powerful people to federal prison. I thought about Constance examining my spice collection, calling my interests ambitious with barely concealed contempt. About Priscilla dismissing my environmental concerns as naive idealism. About Vivian treating my education and expertise like embarrassing hobbies that needed to be managed. They'd spent 3 years systematically undermining my confidence, convincing me that my work didn't matter, that I should focus on being a proper wife instead of pursuing my career. All while I'd been unconsciously building the case that could destroy them. When do you need an answer? I asked. Tomorrow. The grand jury convenes Wednesday, and we need to know if we have our lead analyst. I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent 3 years making myself smaller, quieter, less threatening to people who were literally poisoning children while dismissing my concerns as earnest environmental activism. Sarah, I said slowly, what kind of authority would this position carry? She smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. The kind that comes with a federal badge and the full weight of the EPA behind every decision you make. I thought about Marcus sitting with Priscilla on our couch, seeking comfort from the daughter of the company I'd been investigating. About Vivian orchestrating my exile while her best friend's corporation violated federal environmental law. About 3 years of being told my work didn't matter while I'd been building the case of my career. I don't need until tomorrow, I said. I accept. Sarah's smile widened. Welcome back to the EPA, Senior Analyst Hawthorne. For the first time in 3 years, I heard my professional title spoken with respect instead of dismissal. And I realized that the Hawthorne family was about to learn exactly what they'd been trying so hard to silence. Monday morning arrived with the weight of certainty I hadn't felt in years. I was in the kitchen, dressed in my first business suit in 3 years, navy blue, sharp lines, the kind of outfit that meant serious business, when Marcus finally came home. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and tired. We need to talk, he said, setting his keys on the counter with deliberate precision. Yes, we do, I agreed, pouring myself a final cup of coffee from our machine. But first, I have some news that might interest you. Marcus frowned. News? I got a job offer yesterday. Federal level. Senior environmental analyst with the EPA. I start Wednesday. He blinked, clearly not expecting this development. You what? Celeste, you haven't worked for the government in years. Haven't I? I asked. That's interesting, because the EPA seems to think I've been working for them for the past 3 years. Conducting what they're calling one of the most comprehensive environmental investigations in the region. Marcus stared at me. You're volunteering? My professional work, I corrected. The work your family dismissed as playing in the dirt and collecting water samples for fun. Turns out it's built a federal case worth millions of dollars and several criminal prosecutions. The color drained from Marcus's face. Criminal prosecutions? Oh yes. Environmental crimes, illegal dumping, violation of federal water protection acts. The kind of charges that come with serious prison time. I set down my coffee cup and looked directly at him. The kind of case that could destroy several very prominent families in this community. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across from me. Celeste, what are you saying? I'm saying that while your mother was convincing you I was an embarrassment to the family name, I was actually building a career that could take down some of the most powerful people in your social circle. My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah confirming our meeting with the federal prosecutor that afternoon. I showed Marcus the screen. That's the EPA director asking me to lead the environmental analysis for United States versus Pemberton Holdings and associated parties. Pemberton Holdings? Marcus repeated faintly. As in Constance Pemberton? Your mother's dearest friend. The woman who stood in our living room Friday telling me that my interests were too ambitious for someone with my limited education. I smiled, and it felt sharp as a blade. Turns out my limited education included enough environmental law to identify a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for over a decade. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, his usual gesture when overwhelmed. Celeste, you can't be serious about this. Can't I? Why not, Marcus? Because it would embarrass your family? Because it would make them uncomfortable at their dinner parties? Because it would destroy them, he said, his voice rising. These are people we know, people who've been part of our lives. People who've been poisoning children, I interrupted coldly. People who've been dumping mercury and industrial chemicals into the water supply while dismissing anyone who tried to investigate as naive environmental activists with too much time on their hands. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the herb garden I'd tended so carefully. You know what's really interesting, Marcus? The timeline. My data shows that the illegal dumping escalated significantly right around the time I moved to Willowbrook and started my little environmental projects. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. I turned back to face him. The increase in violations correlates directly with my presence in the community. Someone was concerned that an EPA-trained environmental scientist might notice things that local officials had been paid to ignore. That's paranoid. Is it? Because it would explain a lot. Why your mother never liked me from the beginning. Why Constance always seemed so interested in what I was working on. Why every time I tried to discuss my findings at family gatherings, the conversation got changed so quickly. I walked back to the table and picked up the folder James had given me. 3 years, Marcus. 3 years of your family convincing me that my work didn't matter while I was building the case that's about to destroy their entire world. Marcus looked at the folder like it contained live explosives. Celeste, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the collateral damage. Collateral damage? I repeated. You mean like the families living downstream from Riverside Industrial who've been drinking contaminated water for years? Like the children with elevated cancer rates? Like the entire ecosystem that's been systematically poisoned? I mean like us, Marcus said quietly. Like our marriage. I set the folder down and looked at my husband, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in months. Marcus, there is no us anymore. There hasn't been for a long time. That's not true. It is true. You just didn't want to see it. I sat down across from him one last time. When your mother told me to pack my bags, where were you? In Seattle, at a conference. Having coffee with Priscilla, I finished. When your sister came by to explain how our marriage was probably just a phase you needed to work through, what did you do? Marcus was quiet. When Constance and Vivian and Margaret spent an hour in this house telling me I wasn't good enough for this family, sophisticated enough, educated enough, where were you? I didn't know. You didn't want to know, I corrected. Because knowing would have required you to choose between me and them. And we both know how that choice would have gone. I stood up and straightened my blazer. The EPA is sending a car for me in 10 minutes. By this afternoon, I'll be briefing federal prosecutors on the case I've been building against your mother's social circle. Marcus looked up at me, something like panic in his eyes. Celeste, please. There has to be another way. There is, I said. You could have supported your wife instead of your ex-girlfriend. You could have defended me instead of apologizing for me. You could have seen my worth instead of letting your family convince you I didn't have any. Through the window, I could see the black sedan pulling into the driveway. That's my ride, I said, gathering my briefcase and the folder. Oh, and Marcus? You might want to call a lawyer. A good one. Because when this case goes public, anyone connected to Pemberton Holdings is going to need serious legal representation. Marcus stood up slowly. What about us? I paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. There never was an U.S., Marcus. There was you, trying to keep your family happy. And there was me, disappearing a little more each day to make that possible. I opened the door, then turned back. By the way, Priscilla might want to start looking for a new law firm. Wellington, Cross and Associates is about to become a very unpopular name in federal court. The look of complete shock on Marcus's face was almost satisfying enough to make up for 3 years of being invisible. Almost. The federal building in Washington, D.C. felt like stepping back into my real life after years of playing house in someone else's world. Sarah met me in the lobby, her expression serious but pleased as she escorted me through security and up to the EPA's offices on the 14th floor. "Ready for this?" she asked as we walked down the corridor lined with photographs of protected landscapes and endangered species recovery projects. "I've been ready for 3 years," I said. "I just didn't know it." The conference room was filled with people I recognized from my previous life: federal prosecutors, EPA investigators, environmental lawyers who specialized in corporate crime. At the head of the table sat Assistant Attorney General Patricia Lawson, a woman whose reputation for environmental prosecution was legendary. "Ms. Hawthorne," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming. Sarah tells me you've been conducting what amounts to a 3-year undercover investigation into Pemberton Holdings." "Not undercover," I corrected, settling into the chair across from her. "Just unrecognized." That got a few chuckles around the room. Patricia opened a thick folder and spread out aerial photographs, water quality reports, and chemical analysis charts, all based on my work. "Let's start with what you observed," she said. For the next 2 hours, I walked them through 3 years of data that painted a picture of systematic environmental destruction. Mercury levels that had tripled since 2019. Groundwater contamination affecting 6 residential neighborhoods. Industrial runoff that had killed thousands of fish and contaminated the drinking water for over 50,000 people. The pattern became clear about 18 months ago, I explained, pointing to a series of charts. Pemberton Holdings wasn't just ignoring environmental regulations, they were actively circumventing them. They had arrangements with local inspectors, payoffs to testing companies, even falsified EPA compliance reports. Special Agent Rodriguez, a criminal investigator I'd worked with years ago, leaned forward. "How did you gain access to their internal documents?" "I didn't need access," I said. "The evidence was in the water, the soil, the air quality readings. When you know what to look for, corporate environmental crimes leave signatures as clear as fingerprints." I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the room's display system. 3 years of work filled the screen: graphs, photographs, test results, documented patterns of contamination that told a story of deliberate criminal negligence. Pemberton Holdings has been using Riverside Industrial as a front for illegal waste disposal, I continued. They've been taking contaminated materials from their other facilities across 3 states and dumping them here in Willowbrook, where they thought no one was watching. Patricia studied the timeline I'd created. "Ms. Hawthorne, this level of documentation would normally require a team of federal investigators working for months. How did you accomplish this as a volunteer?" "I had motivation," I said simply. "And a lot of nights when I couldn't sleep." What I didn't say was that those sleepless nights had started when Marcus began having his work stress episodes, the same period when the dumping had escalated. When he'd started spending more time on his phone, taking calls in other rooms, having sudden business trips that didn't quite add up. Agent Rodriguez pulled out another folder. "We've been building financial records on Pemberton Holdings for the past 6 months. What we couldn't figure out was how they were coordinating the illegal activities across multiple sites. Your data helped us identify the pattern." He spread out bank records and financial transfers. "Every spike in contamination you documented corresponds with large cash transfers through offshore accounts. Someone was paying substantial amounts to coordinate these operations. Someone with access to significant financial resources," Patricia added. "Someone connected to multiple industries, with the social standing to influence local officials." I stared at the financial records, pieces clicking into place. Constance Pemberton doesn't just own the company. She's been running a criminal enterprise. "With help," Agent Rodriguez said. We've identified at least 6 co-conspirators, including local officials who falsified inspection reports and testing companies that provided fraudulent compliance documentation. Sarah leaned forward. Celeste, we need to discuss something sensitive. Your investigation was so thorough, so precisely targeted, that it raises questions about how you knew where to look. The room went quiet. I could feel everyone's attention focusing on me with laser intensity. What kind of questions? I asked. Questions about whether you had inside information, Patricia said carefully. Whether someone close to the operation might have been feeding you intelligence, either knowingly or unknowingly. My blood went cold as the implication hit me. You think Marcus was involved? We think someone in your household had access to information about Pemberton Holdings operations, Sarah said gently. Someone who knew enough about their activities to unconsciously guide your investigation toward the most damaging evidence. I thought about Marcus's sudden work trips, his mysterious phone calls, his increasing stress levels that coincided perfectly with the escalation in illegal dumping. His family's connections to Pemberton Holdings, their desperate attempts to silence my environmental work, their coordinated campaign to remove me from the picture entirely. Jesus, I breathed. He wasn't just tolerating his family's treatment of me. He was protecting them. Agent Rodriguez nodded grimly. Marcus Hawthorne's name appears on several financial documents related to Pemberton Holdings. Consulting fees, environmental compliance consulting, risk assessment services. Environmental compliance consulting. While I'd been conducting actual environmental monitoring, my husband had been getting paid to help cover up environmental crimes. How long? I asked. The payment started approximately 6 months before you moved to Willowbrook, Patricia said. Right around the time you and Marcus got engaged. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had been involved in this criminal conspiracy before we were married. His family's objections to me weren't about social status or family expectations. They were about operational security. I was an EPA-trained environmental scientist who'd married into a family running environmental crimes. My presence in Willowbrook hadn't just been inconvenient, it had been a threat to a multi-million-dollar criminal operation. The eviction, I said slowly. Getting me out of the house, bringing in Priscilla, it wasn't about the marriage. It was about the investigation. Sarah nodded. They needed you removed before the federal investigation began. Before your documentation could be used as evidence. But they were too late, Agent Rodriguez added with satisfaction. You'd already built the case. All we needed was someone brave enough to testify. Patricia closed the folder and looked directly at me. Ms. Hawthorne, what you've uncovered represents one of the largest environmental crime conspiracies we've prosecuted in the past decade. When this case goes public, it will destroy several prominent families and send multiple people to federal prison. Including my husband? That depends on his level of cooperation, she said carefully. But yes, based on the financial evidence, Marcus Hawthorne is facing serious federal charges. I sat back in my chair, processing the magnitude of what I'd stumbled into. For 3 years, I'd been married to a man who was being paid to help cover up the environmental crimes I was unconsciously exposing. I'd been sleeping next to someone who was actively working against everything I believed in. And his family hadn't been trying to get rid of me because I wasn't good enough for their world. They'd been trying to silence me because I was too dangerous for their criminal enterprise. So what happens now? I asked. Patricia smiled, and it was sharp as a blade. Now we take them down. All of them. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I stood in the same federal courtroom where I'd spent weeks testifying, watching as the final sentences were handed down. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of justice as he addressed the defendants seated at the table before him. Constance Pemberton, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy to violate environmental protection laws, racketeering, and criminal endangerment of public health. Constance, once the queen of Willowbrook society, sat rigid in her orange jumpsuit, her perfectly styled silver hair now showing gray roots. She didn't look in my direction, but I felt the hatred radiating from her like heat. Wellington Cross, 8 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Priscilla's father had aged a decade in 6 months. His law firm had collapsed within days of the indictments being unsealed. His daughter sat in the gallery behind him, no longer the polished socialite who tried to steal my life. The divorce that had supposedly driven her to need my guest room? Completely fabricated. She'd been single for over a year, positioning herself to move in the moment I was removed from the picture. Margaret Hawthorne Stone, 5 years for money laundering and conspiracy. Marcus's aunt had tried to claim ignorance, but financial records showed she'd been facilitating payments through her charity foundation for years. Vivian sat beside her daughter in the gallery, wearing black like she was attending a funeral. Which, in a way, she was, the funeral of everything her family had built on criminal foundations. Marcus Hawthorne. My ex-husband stood slowly, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. He'd lost weight during the trial, the stress of facing federal charges and public disgrace taking its toll. In consideration of your cooperation with federal investigators and your testimony against your co-conspirators, you are sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Marcus had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his family and their associates in exchange for reduced charges. His cooperation had been crucial in exposing the full scope of the conspiracy, but it hadn't saved him from prison. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into bright October sunshine. The media circus that had surrounded the trial was finally winding down, but photographers still snapped pictures as I descended the steps. "Ms. Hawthorne," called Janet Williams from the Washington Post. "How does it feel to see justice served?" I paused, considering my words carefully. For months, reporters had tried to frame this as a story of revenge, the scorned wife who brought down her husband's family. But that had never been what this was about. "This was never personal," I said into the cluster of microphones. "This was about protecting public health and holding powerful people accountable for criminal behavior." Today's sentences send a clear message that wealth and social status don't put anyone above environmental law. "Will you be returning to Willowbrook?" asked another reporter. I smiled. "My work there is finished." That evening, I sat in my new apartment in Washington, D.C., looking out at the Potomac River while I prepared for my next assignment. The EPA had promoted me to Regional Director for Environmental Crimes, overseeing investigations across the entire Mid-Atlantic region. My salary was triple what Marcus had ever made, and my work was protecting millions of people from corporate environmental crimes. My phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison. "Millbrook Creek is running clear again. The fish are coming back. Thank you." The environmental restoration of Willowbrook was already showing results. Pemberton Holdings had been forced to fund a massive cleanup effort as part of their civil settlement. The water was cleaner than it had been in decades, and the community finally knew the truth about what had been done to them. Another text, this one from Sarah Chin. "Dinner tonight? We need to discuss the North Carolina case." I was already building my next investigation, following a pattern of industrial contamination that stretched from Virginia to South Carolina. The work was challenging, important, and exactly what I'd been meant to do with my life. My doorbell rang, and I found Elena standing in the hallway. Marcus's sister looked smaller somehow, diminished by the collapse of everything she'd once thought made her special. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by department store basics. The Hawthorne family fortune, built on criminal enterprises, had been seized by federal authorities. "Celeste," she said quietly. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, curious despite myself. Elena had lost everything, her status, her husband, who'd filed for divorce the day after her mother's arrest, her children's college funds, her entire identity as a Hawthorne family princess. "I wanted to apologize," she said, standing awkwardly in my living room. "For everything. For how we treated you, for what we said, for trying to make you disappear." "Elena." "No, let me finish." Her voice was steadier than I'd expected. "I spent my whole life believing that being a Hawthorne meant something special. I thought our wealth, our connections, our status made us better than everyone else." She looked around my apartment, taking in the environmental awards on the walls, the photographs from restoration projects, the evidence of a life built on actual achievement rather than inherited privilege. You were everything we pretended to be, she continued. Smart, accomplished, doing work that actually mattered. And instead of recognizing that, we tried to tear you down because it threatened our fantasy about ourselves. What happened to your children? I asked. Elena's composure cracked slightly. They're with their father. Private schools, stable home, away from all the scandal. She wiped her eyes. It's better for them. They don't need to grow up thinking that crime and corruption are family traditions. What will you do now? I don't know, she admitted. I'm 38 years old, and I've never had a real job. I've never accomplished anything on my own merit. I spent so much time judging other people for not being born into privilege that I never learned how to actually earn anything. I studied Marcus's sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Stripped of her designer armor and family money, she looked lost but not unsympathetic. Elena, I said carefully, what if I told you there was a way to start over? To build something real? She looked up hopefully. The EPA has a victims assistance program for environmental crime cases. We help communities recover from corporate contamination. It's hard work, unglamorous, but it makes a real difference. You'd recommend me? I'd give you a chance to prove yourself, I corrected. The same chance you never gave me. Elena nodded slowly. I'd like that. I'd like to try being someone worth respecting. After she left, I returned to my work, preparing for the congressional hearing where I'd present findings from the Willowbrook investigation. The case had become a landmark in environmental law, cited in legal journals and used as a model for future prosecutions. My phone rang, an unknown number with a familiar area code. Hello? Celeste? It's Marcus. I hadn't spoken to my ex-husband since the trial ended. His voice sounded hollow, aged beyond his years. What do you want, Marcus? I wanted to say I'm sorry. For all of it. For choosing them over you, for being part of something so destructive, for not seeing who you really were until it was too late. Marcus. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. I know I can't undo the damage or take back the years you spent disappearing because of my family's selfishness. I was quiet, letting him finish. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything. About me, about them, about who deserved respect and who didn't. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too weak and too stupid to protect it. Goodbye, Marcus, I said gently, and hung up. The sun was setting over the Potomac, painting the water gold and orange. Tomorrow, I'd testify before Congress about corporate environmental crimes. Next month, I'd lead the investigation into industrial contamination in North Carolina. My work would protect communities, hold criminals accountable, and ensure that powerful people couldn't poison the environment with impunity. I opened my laptop and pulled up the case files for my next investigation. Somewhere out there, another community was being poisoned by corporate criminals who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The quiet girl they tried so hard to silence had found her voice. And she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.